Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, April 30th, 2025. Commerce Department says the United States economy, as measured by the gross domestic product, GDP, shrank in the first quarter of the year by 0.3%. First time that's happened in 3 years. There was a surge in imports as companies tried to stock up before President Donald Trump's high tariffs take effect. Coming up, we get reaction from President Trump at a cabinet meeting at the White House and from the Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer. Senate expected to pass a resolution to disapprove the national emergency declaration the president is using as the legal basis for the global tariffs. U.S. Customs and Border Protection Commissioner nominee Rodney Scott testifies before the Senate Finance Committee, asked about allegations he helped cover up the death of an immigrant in Border Patrol custody in 2010. And the Supreme Court hears oral argument in a case from Oklahoma about the constitutionality of states supporting religious charter schools. We'll talk about it with Washington Post education reporter Laura Meckler. CNBC writes that President Donald Trump on Wednesday blamed his predecessor and defended his sweeping tariffs after new data showed the U.S. economy contracted last quarter, while warning that his promised boom will take a while. This is former President Joe Biden's stock market, not Trump's. I didn't take over until January 20th, Trump said in a Truth Social post. He went on, the tariffs will soon start kicking in and companies are starting to move into the USA in record numbers. Our country will boom, but we'll have to get rid of the Biden overhang. This will take a while, has nothing to do with tariffs, only that he left us with bad numbers. But when the boom begins, it will be like no other. Be patient. The article at CNBC goes on, the defensive social media post came less than an hour after release of a U.S. Department of Commerce report showing gross domestic product fell at a 0.3% annualized pace in the first 3 months of the year. It was the first quarter of negative growth since Q1 of 2022. President Trump spoke about the GDP report and tariffs at the start of his cabinet meeting at the White House.
You probably saw some numbers today, and I have to start off by saying that's Biden. That's not Trump, because we came in on January, this is the quarterly numbers, and we came in and I was very against everything that Biden was doing in terms of the economy, destroying our country in so many ways, not only at the border was more obvious, but we took over his mess in so many different ways. Core GDP, removing distortions from imports, inventories, and government spending, was up plus 3% when you add it. We had numbers that despite what we were handed, we turned them around, and we were getting them really turned around. Gross domestic investment was a whopping 22%. Now, that is a number that people are coming in at numbers. For instance, I just walked in, I heard Samsung is now, because of the tariffs, they're going to build massive facilities in the United States. If we didn't do the tariffs, they wouldn't be doing that. So it takes a little while to get those facilities built, but they're coming in with big numbers. They're all coming in with big numbers. We have more money being spent than at any time in the history of our country. We're up to close to $8 trillion, I think I can say. And really, it's going to be a lot higher than that. Those are just the ones that we know about. 8 trillion. I'm not going to say, but I'm not sure if Biden did $1 trillion for 4 years, 1 trillion. But we're at 8 trillion for 2 months, because let's give us a pass on the first month. We were sort of getting a little bit used to things, right? But after 2 months, we have $8 trillion. There's never been a number like that. And that includes chip companies, car companies, every form of manufacturing, high-tech companies. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. So $8 trillion.
President Donald Trump at the start of a cabinet meeting at the White House. Again, from the CNBC article, President Trump's claim that the negative GDP and subsequent market declines were a result of Biden's policies is inaccurate. According to the Commerce Department, the GDP figure reflects a wave of imports that companies made in an effort to get ahead of Trump's promised tariffs. Also weighing on GDP was a drop last quarter in government spending, driven largely by a cut in defense. Again, from the CNBC article. Reuters reports that China has created a list of U.S.-made products that would be exempted from its 125% tariff and is quietly notifying companies about the policy. two people familiar with the matter said, as Beijing seeks to ease the impact of its trade war with Washington. China has already granted tariff exemptions on select products, including select pharmaceuticals, microchips, and aircraft engines, and was asking firms to identify critical goods they need levy-free, Reuters reported on Friday. However, the existence of a so-called white list has not been previously reported. The quiet approach allows Beijing, which has repeatedly said it is willing to fight till the end unless the U.S. lifts its 145% tariffs, to maintain its public messaging while privately taking practical steps to provide concessions. That was the Reuters article. President Trump at the cabinet meeting was asked when he would speak to Chinese President Xi Jinping about tariffs.
When will you speak to President Xi of China?
That'll happen. I mean, look, right now, and I told you before, they're having tremendous difficulty because their factories are not doing business. They made $1 trillion with Biden, $1 trillion, even $1.1 trillion with Biden selling us stuff. Much of it we don't need. You know, somebody said, oh, the shelves are going to be open. Well, maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30, you know? And maybe the $2 will cost a couple of bucks more than they would normally. But we're not talking about something that we have to go out of our way. They have ships that are loaded up with stuff, much of which, not all of it, but much of which we don't need. And we have to make a fair deal. We've been ripped off by every country in the world, but China, I would say, is the leading one, the leading candidate for the chief ripper offer.
President Trump at the cabinet meeting at the White House, called the day after the president reached his first 100 days in office. The president had each of his cabinet members give an update on his or her department or agency activity, then took a few reporters' questions. Whole thing ran about 2 hours. We covered it live on C-SPAN Radio, and you can find the full video at cspan.org. A few other headlines that came out of the meeting. President Trump said that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who led his Liberal Party to election victory this week on a platform of opposing President Trump's tariffs, will visit the White House next week. The president also said that Raytheon Technologies and IBM may get the contract to modernize the U.S. air traffic control system. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that he would never tell if he had been in touch with El Salvador President Nayib Bukele to return Kilmar Abrego Garcia to the U.S., even to a judge. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said the U.S. is ready to sign a mineral deal with Ukraine this afternoon, but added there had been a last-minute snag. He said the Ukrainians decided last night to make some last-minute changes. We're sure that they will reconsider that, and we're ready to sign this afternoon. Back to tariffs and the GDP report. The Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, spoke today on the Senate floor.
Americans woke up this morning to some very troubling news. The economy shrank in the first quarter of 2025 by 0.3%. It shrank. It was growing until now. It shrank. It's the worst quarter in years. Businesses, families, and consumers are bracing themselves for the hammer blow of Donald Trump's tariffs, and it's sending the economy into a tailspin. Today's GDP numbers show that Donald Trump is running America the same way he ran his businesses, into the ground. Before our very eyes, Donald Trump's policies of tariffs and tax hikes are strangling the economy. Donald Trump's first 100 days have been defined by one big F word: failure. Donald Trump's first 100 days have been defined by an F word: failure. Failure on the economy, failure to lower costs, failure on foreign policy, failure on democracy, failure everywhere you look. Donald Trump must admit his failure and reverse course, and immediately fire his economic team. Otherwise, we'll see more of the same: failure and chaos and total incompetence. His tariff strategy: total failure. China's not coming to the table. Manufacturing's not racing back to our shores. There's no strategy, only chaos. Every day, he changes his mind. One day he says yes to tariffs, the next day no. One day this country's on the list, the next day that country's on the list. No tariffs, double the tariffs, on and on and on. And as he's doing this, his policy advisors have different explanations for what he's doing and why he's doing it. Businesses pay the price for Donald Trump's failed policies. When businesses don't know what the president will do next, they can't plan for the failure. They're not going to hire workers. I've talked to business leaders, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and big businesses in New York, and I'm sure this is true around the country. They're holding off on any new spending because they don't know what Donald Trump will do next. His chaos is just totally impeding our economy. We're seeing it happen in real time. And because the tariff policy has been such a mess, such a failure, today, later today, Senators Wyden, Kaine, and I will force a vote here in the Senate to stop Donald Trump's trade wars. Our Republican colleagues have an opportunity to stop Donald Trump. Our resolution presents Republicans with a choice: stand with Donald Trump or stand with American families. The GDP number today should be a wake-up call to Republican senators now more than ever. 4 voted with us last time on tariffs about Canada. Many more should vote with us this time, given the new numbers and given that this resolution covers all of the countries that Donald Trump has so failed with on tariffs.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, on the Senate floor. About that vote that he mentioned, this from Politico, the Senate appears on track to once again reject tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump's sweeping tariff agenda, with several key Republican senators confirming they will vote Wednesday to overturn his sweeping use of executive power to impose a 10% global levy. Both Senator Susan Collins of Maine and Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska indicated they would support a disapproval resolution, despite efforts by leadership and the administration to soothe concerns about the economic uncertainty that the tariffs have unleashed. Collins told reporters of the effort, "It is not perfect. I think it's too broad, but it sends the message that I want to send, that we really need to be far more discriminatory in imposing those tariffs." Collins and Murkowski joined Kentucky Republicans Rand Paul and Mitch McConnell to help approve a resolution disapproving of the Trump administration's tariffs on Canada earlier this month. Paul is a sponsor of the new measure to overturn the global tariffs. That was the Politico article. Here's some of the debate on the resolution today. Senator Mike Crapo, Republican of Idaho, Finance Committee Chair, will be voting no.
The administration has shared that serious negotiations are proceeding, with 18 countries at a minimum now, and with more to follow shortly. In the coming weeks, the U.S. Trade Representative will meet with the Senate Advisory Group on negotiations and the Finance Committee to discuss these negotiations in detail. I encourage my colleagues to trust the President, at least until they've had the opportunity to hear from his trade team about their efforts. As the White House recently argued in its statement of administrative policy, this resolution, if we passed it, would signal to U.S. trading partners that they can continue to discriminate against U.S. exports with impunity, and would signal that the United States is not serious about addressing structural imbalances in the global economy and the conditions giving rise to the threat to the United States' national security and economy. Disapproving this emergency will undercut the serious negotiations that are underway, which are also yielding results. For example, India has already suspended its digital services tax on U.S. companies. The President is a good negotiator, and he deserves more time and our support. Ending these negotiations at their inception benefits only one actor: China. China will see its full reciprocal tariff limited immediately without offering any concessions to addressing long-standing bipartisan grievances. Moreover, China will benefit because its trade negotiations will continue while ours will sputter out.
Senator Mike Crapo, Republican of Idaho, chair of the Finance Committee, on the Senate floor. Senator Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, spoke in favor of the disapproval resolution.
Our Constitution forbids taxes from being enacted without the approval of Congress. And yet here we are. An emergency has been declared, as the senator from Virginia remarked, everywhere. There's an emergency everywhere. Sounds like an emergency everywhere is really an emergency nowhere. But despite the constitutional restraints or constraints on executive power, Americans have now been ordered to pay higher taxes in the form of tariffs, but without the consent of Congress. The tariffs we discuss today are global tariffs. Just about every country in the world is subjected to at least a 10% tariff, to say nothing of the dozens of countries whose imports will be taxed at a much higher rate. Congress didn't debate these tariffs. Congress didn't vote to enact these tariffs. The tariffs are simply imposed by presidential fiat, by proclamation. Government by one person assumes all power by asserting a so-called emergency is the antithesis of constitutional government.
Senator Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, on the Senate floor, and the Senate is expected to pass this disapproval resolution tonight, with most Democrats voting yes and key Republicans also voting yes. Wall Street today, the Dow up 141, NASDAQ down 14, S&P up 8. C-SPAN's Capitol Hill producer Craig Kaplan posting on X, 52-46. The Senate, along party lines, voted to repeal a Biden administration Energy Department rule on new appliance energy efficiency certification, reporting, and labeling requirements. House passed the joint disapproval resolution 222-203 in March, now heads to President Trump, who plans to sign it. That's the post from C-SPAN's Capitol Hill producer. On the Senate floor, before the vote, here's Senator John Husted, Republican from Ohio.
I am proud to stand here and lead this common sense legislation to reverse the cumbersome Biden-era regulation that we are addressing today. This resolution overturns a Biden-era Department of Energy rule that expands paperwork, testing, and reporting requirements for home and commercial appliance manufacturers without improving performance standards. In other words, this rule wastes time and money, raising costs without delivering meaningful energy savings on items like dishwashers, clothes washers, and HVAC systems, things that people need to live and thrive every day. These are just everyday products that Ohioans depend on, and this Biden-era overreach makes it harder to afford them and leaves consumers with fewer choices and more costs. While I've been in Washington only a few months, I can see the drag that the inflationary policies of the last administration have had on the American people, and it is my priority to make America and Ohio better places to work, live, and thrive. That's why repeal of unnecessary regulations is so important. This bill contributes to the goal of cutting red tape for manufacturers, which gives consumers more choices and lower costs. Mr. President, this common sense bill that has earned bipartisan support in the House is ready to be passed in the Senate and sent to the President's desk. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this legislation when we vote today. A vote for this bill is a vote for making life easier and more affordable for American consumers. I thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Senator John Husted, Republican from Ohio, on the Senate floor before the successful passage of this resolution. Party line vote 52-46. Now heads to President Trump, who does plan to sign it into law. This bill was passed using the Congressional Review Act, or CRA, which allows Congress to overturn executive branch regulations within a certain period of time. The House today took up 3 more of these, all dealing with California emission standards for cars and trucks. This is Washington Today. Story from CNBC. D.O.G.E chief Elon Musk claimed Wednesday that his federal workforce slashing initiative so far has saved $160 billion, far less than his original projections, as the mega billionaire Tesla CEO gave a sort of farewell to President Donald Trump's cabinet. Musk said last week on a Tesla earnings call that his time spent running the so-called Department of Government Efficiency will drop significantly beginning in May, and that he plans to spend just a day or two per week on the government effort. That was the CNBC article. Elon Musk joined President Trump at today's cabinet meeting at the White House. You're going to hear a reference to two hats. Elon Musk had a baseball cap with D.O.G.E on the front and a second baseball cap given to all the cabinet secretaries that had Gulf of America on the front, and Musk was wearing them both, one stacked on the other.
Elon, I love the double hat, by the way. He's the only one that can do that. Get away with it.
Well, Mr. President, they say I wear a lot of hats. It's true. Even my hat has a hat. The American people voted for secure borders, safe cities, and sensible spending. And that's what they've gotten. A tremendous amount has been accomplished in the first 100 days. As everyone has said, it's more than has been accomplished in any administration before, ever, period. This portends very well for what will happen for the rest of the administration. I think this could be the greatest administration since the founding of the country.
Well, we all want to thank you for your help, too. You really have sacrificed a lot. Been treated very unfairly.
Well, they do like to rent my cars, which is not great. Could be better.
But you have been treated unfairly. But the vast majority of people in this country really respect and appreciate you, and this whole room can say that very strongly. You've really been a tremendous help. You opened up a lot of eyes as to what could be done, and we just want to thank you very much. And you're invited to stay as long as you want. At some point, I guess he wants to get back home to his cars and his. You've done an incredible job. $150 billion. Think of that.
Yeah. 160 now.
Yeah, 160. They said, "Oh, it could have been more." And a lot of stuff is being worked on. That number could be doubled and even tripled. A lot of things are being worked on that we don't count yet because it's not quite there. But you've done a fantastic job, and we appreciate it very much, Elon.
Thank you. And it's also an honor to work with your incredible cabinet. I just like to say thank you, everyone. It's great to work with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Elon Musk and President Donald Trump at today's cabinet meeting at the White House. There's a headline today at Bloomberg. Elon Musk lost 25% of fortune since Trump took office, and the article says that amounts to $113 billion. New York Times article this month, the White House is planning to ask Congress to claw back more than $1 billion slated for public broadcasting in the United States. According to two people briefed on the plan, a move that could ultimately eliminate almost all federal support for NPR and PBS. Again, that was from the New York Times article. The CEO of PBS, Paula Kerber, was interviewed today by Sarah Fisher, Axios senior media reporter.
I first want you to respond to Speaker Johnson. He said that in a free market, you should be able to make your case for why PBS deserves government funding. In 30 seconds, make your case.
Yeah, I actually agree. I think anyone that is asking for federal funding should be very clear on why it's important. And I think it's important to understand that the federal appropriation actually goes to our stations. Most of the money that comes in through the federal government was designed to ensure that we have public media stations in all parts of the country. And it's especially important for parts of the country where without that support, there wouldn't be public media stations. So for me, that's the strongest argument. I've spent a lot of time on the road. I've visited a lot of stations. In many communities, our public television, public radio stations are the last remaining locally owned and operated media companies.
And just remind the audience, how many of those local stations fall under that PBS umbrella?
We have 330 stations across the country. So we are in every community.
When we think about what's been happening lately in terms of public funding for media, the Trump administration has tried to go after your funding as well as the funding of USAGM, which is the VOA parent. Yesterday was a very newsy day. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is the entity that funds PBS and NPR, sued the Trump administration for trying to fire 3 of its board directors. Within hours, a federal judge halted that through an injunction. I would like your reaction to that situation.
Yeah, so CPB should speak about their own board circumstance, but from what I understand, those 3 board members, you know, they're nominated by the president, they're approved by the Senate. This is not a government agency. This is a nonprofit organization that was set up to receive the federal appropriation and then distribute it out to the stations. Their job principally is to make sure that the stations are well run and that they are worthy recipients of funding. They do that for public television, public radio stations, and I think have done an excellent job. So it was a little surprising yesterday because they are an independent company, as we are. We're a separate 501c3 organization, so we'll obviously be following that very carefully.
If Donald Trump were to go after your board members, would you take the same action and sue?
Well, it would be hard to understand how that's possible because we're a nonprofit 501c3. We have no connection to the federal government whatsoever, but of course, if anyone went after our board in any way, we would defend it vigorously. We have an outstanding board that does an extraordinary job in making sure that we are meeting the needs of the communities that we serve. Half of our board are the presidents of stations from around the country, and then we have a wonderful group of leaders representing both parties, that represent a broad spectrum of interests and experience, and they do, I think, a really terrific job in making sure that we are meeting the needs of the public.
PBS CEO Paula Kerber interviewed by Sarah Fisher, Axios senior media reporter at an Axios program on President Trump's first 100 days. The story from The Hill, a GOP-backed push for cuts to public broadcasting, is picking up momentum in Congress as lawmakers brace for a formal request from the Trump administration to claw back millions of dollars in funds. But concerns are bubbling up among some Republicans over what those cuts could mean for programs and constituents back home. House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican of Louisiana, was also interviewed today at the Axios Forum by Hans Nichols, a political reporter. And Speaker Johnson gave a status update on the One Big Beautiful Bill, as it's being called, budget reconciliation containing tax cuts, spending cuts, energy production, defense, and border security.
Up late last night?
Yes, every night. Good job.
100 days?
Yes.
It's been a lot?
Yes, it has. It's like 1,000 days in some ways.
We probably have another 100 days before we go, before that one big, beautiful bill?
No, sooner than that.
Okay, well then what? Convince me otherwise, because your timeline is Memorial Day to get out of the House. We've heard pretty clearly from the Senate that it's, July 4th. So does that mean the Senate's just going to accept everything you guys do?
Yes. Don't they always do that? No. It's a very aggressive timetable for a reason. We're trying to get this done. My original aspiration was by Memorial Day for the whole thing, but I've accepted reality. We'll get it out of the House by then, and then we'll send it to the Senate. I hope the Senate doesn't do a whole cloth rewrite. I hope they accept a lot of what we've done. We're working very closely with our Senate colleagues. Leader Thune and I talk all the time, meet at least once a week with our lieutenants. We have a big 6 meeting once a week, and that's the Treasury Secretary and Kevin Hassett at NEC, Senator Crapo, Leader Thune, myself, and Jason Smith, the Ways and Means Chair. And we meet with all of our top staffers. So there's a very close coordination. There's no secrets or surprises. And so the legislation that's sent over there, I think, will be well received. I hope they don't do much to modify it. And I think we can get it to the president's desk quickly.
But, Mr. Speaker, respectfully, hope isn't necessarily a strategy, right? They have serious senators over there who have serious concerns about the bill that you are drafting, and they are not going to rubber stamp that. So July 4th almost seems too optimistic for them.
I don't think so. I mean, that was the Treasury Secretary said July 4th this week in public statements, and we applauded that. But I really hope we do it sooner. And here's the reason why. It has nothing to do with pride of authorship in the House or any of that. We just want to deliver for the American people, and so do all of our Senate Republican colleagues. The America First agenda, the vehicle to deliver that is reconciliation. And the sooner we do it, the better, Hans, because I think this will be a very important thing for stability. I think it'll send a very important signal to the bond markets, the stock market, to investors and job creators here and around the world. And It'll send a message to our allies and our enemies that America is serious. We have stabilized tax policy. Everyone will know what their tax rates are. That will be helpful for making decisions for companies. And also, of course, we're going to be deficit neutral or deficit reducing. We're trying to reduce the debt. And I think that's a really important message to send out there, that America is serious about our financial stability. And this bill is going to be, that's one of the many things that will be accomplished in it.
House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican of Louisiana, at an Axios forum today in Washington. It's a story from Punchbowl News. Senator Ron Johnson, Republican of Wisconsin, told us that, as it stands now, he cannot vote for the House Republicans' reconciliation package. Johnson said there are enough senators here that are insisting on returning to a reasonable pre-pandemic level of spending, which we're not even coming close to in terms of what the House is working on. That will go nowhere here in the Senate. The administration has to understand that. Reporting from Punchbowl News. Washington Today continues in a moment.
If you ever miss any of C-SPAN's coverage, you can find it anytime online at cspan.org. Videos of key hearings, debates, and other events feature markers that guide you to interesting and newsworthy highlights. These points of interest markers appear on the right-hand side of your screen when you hit play on select videos. This timeline tool makes it easy to quickly get an idea of what was debated and decided in Washington. Scroll through and spend a few minutes on C-SPAN's points of interest.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. A story from Government Executive. President Donald Trump's nominee to lead the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency, Rodney Scott, told the Senate Finance Committee on Wednesday that he would focus on the agency's workforce to manage trade and border crossings, while the committee's top Democrat, Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, accused him of covering up a 2010 death at a CBP facility he oversaw. Senator Wyden raised concerns about the death at a CBP station in San Diego that Scott ran. Anastasio Hernandez Rojas was detained by CBP officers, where he was beaten and later died from his injuries, Wyden said. Wyden said rather than following the agency's own policy and immediately referring the incident to outside investigators, the San Diego CBP office began its own investigation. In the course of that investigation, the officers taped over the only video copy of Hernandez Rojas' death and tampered with physical evidence, according to court documents. That's the statement from Senator Ron Wyden, as reported by Government Executive. Here is the Finance Committee Chair, Mike Crapo, Republican from Idaho, questioning Rodney Scott about this case.
As you are aware from the discussions that have already taken place, some of my colleagues have raised concerns about your administrative involvement in the year 2010 with regard to the death in custody incident relating to Mr. Hernandez Rojas. He died 2 days after being held in custody by CBP agents on immigration and assault charges. A death like this is always tragic, and I would like to have the public better understand some of the facts, including any role in which you may have played in that incident. First of all, were you involved in the decision to detain Mr. Rojas at the border and his actual detention?
No, I was not.
Were you even there in that vicinity?
No, sir.
Did you serve as an investigator on the critical incident team?
No, sir.
Did you sign an administrative subpoena in the Rojas investigation upon advice of counsel?
Yes, sir.
And what was the purpose of that subpoena?
The subpoena was information gathering, the medical records specifically because of the individual was in our custody when the injury and the death occurred.
And it was standard procedure?
Yes, sir.
And did you do anything in the investigation of that case to interfere with the investigation of that case?
Absolutely not.
All right, thank you.
Senator Mike Crapo, Republican from Idaho, Finance Committee Chair, questioning U.S. Customs and Border Protection Commissioner nominee Rodney Scott at today's hearing. Rodney Scott was Chief of Border Patrol, an agency within CBP, during the first Trump administration and former President Joe Biden's administration. More from the Government Executive magazine article. The U.S. paid $1 million to settle a lawsuit brought by Hernandez Rojas' widow. The Justice Department in 2015 declined to pursue federal charges against any of the officers or leaders involved in the Hernandez Rojas case. Senator Ron Wyden, ranking Democrat on the Finance Committee, questioned Rodney Scott about a related issue, a tweet Rodney Scott sent in response to criticism from a former female agent who was a survivor of sexual assault.
You tweeted what a judge referred to as a classic rape threat to a former Border Patrol agent who was critical of your leadership. And you tweeted at her on this matter, quote, "Lean back, close your eyes, and just enjoy the show." To a former officer who took issue with you in CBP leadership for the culture you'd fostered, a culture that included the alleged cover-up of the brutal killing of Mr. Rojas, this strikes me as exceptionally troubling. She had said that she had been raped while she was at the academy, and you chose to respond with a rape threat. And a San Diego judge called it a classic rape threat and said, maybe you were the only purpose in the world that never heard of a lie back and take it as referring to rape. Now, as far as I can tell, there hasn't been any real apology, no apology in court. Do you think this is acceptable, in your view, to respond to a former officer in this way?
So I'd like to thank you for bringing this up, because I like to clear the air. There was an apology. I actually, even after that court, went and met with her specifically in front of witnesses with her attorney and said the same thing I did in court with a little more. That was not my intent. I was challenging after about 4 years of being insulted left and right. I had a weak moment. I apologize for that, but I was not making any type of a threat. I was challenging her creative imagination that I had asked her for.
Pardon me, you were challenging her creative imagination about rape?
That is not what I said. I was challenging her creative imagination about multiple allegations against me and the agency that she would never provide any information or data to support or any evidence. But regardless, I apologized to her. I told her that I believed it was out of line. I did not mean for it to come across that way, and I wanted her to know. I told her that to her face.
So you're apologizing now, because I know you didn't apologize in court either.
I apologized to her in the hallway right outside the courtroom doors in front of her friends, her attorney, and I don't know who else was there.
Rodney Scott, nominated to lead U.S. Customs and Border Protection, questioned by Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat of Oregon, ranking member on the Finance Committee at today's hearing. The government executive article has this: CBP has more than 60,000 employees and manages more than 300 ports of entry at borders, airports, and seaports. Story from the Washington Post. In one of the most significant cases of the term, the Supreme Court's conservative majority seemed willing to allow the nation's first religious public charter school, permitting direct and complete taxpayer funding for a faith-based school for the first time. Coming up, we'll talk with a reporter who wrote that article. First, some of the oral argument. Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Clarence Thomas questioning James Campbell, attorney for Oklahoma Charter School Board, who approved the money to St. Isidore of Seville Virtual Catholic School in Oklahoma. The combined case is Oklahoma Charter School Board v. Drummond and St. Isidore v. Drummond.
You rely heavily on in your brief on a number of cases, Trinity Lutheran, Espinoza, Carson. Those involve fairly discrete state involvement. In Trinity Lutheran, they're going to pave the put wood chips on the playground. In Espinoza, it was a tuition credit. In Carson, again, tax credits. I mean, this does strike me as a much more comprehensive involvement. And I wonder what case do you think supports the position with respect to that level of involvement?
We think Carson does, because Carson established the principle that when the state creates a program or a public benefit, that it can't exclude groups or people just because they're religious. And that's exactly what we have here. The state of Oklahoma has created a charter school program, and it's invited private actors to participate, but it's telling religious groups and religious groups alone that they don't belong. Certainly the facts here are different than the facts in Carson, but the principle is on all fours with what we're arguing.
Thank you. Justice Thomas?
How different is the involvement of the board in school operation as compared to, say, an accrediting authority?
And by the board, do you mean the state board?
Yes.
Yeah, so the state board acts in many ways like an accrediting authority. And so one of the things that my friend on the other side talks about is that there are opportunities for private religious groups to get measures of public funding. But in order to access any of those programs, those private schools need to be accredited. And accrediting organizations, they look at a high level at the curriculum to ensure that things like state standards are satisfied. That's all that our board is doing. I think one example to illustrate the point is that if one of our charter schools came to us and said, we want to entirely change our mission, we want to go from being an organization focused on Native American culture and now we want to be a STEM school, that would be the kind of change that the board might look at, but the board is not going to dig into the details of anyone's curriculum. That's not their charge.
James Campbell, attorney for Oklahoma Charter School Board, questioned by Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Clarence Thomas. Joining us now to talk about today's Supreme Court oral argument in the case Oklahoma Charter School Board v. Drummond is Laura Meckler, the Washington Post education reporter. Thanks for being with us. You wrote that sharp ideological differences emerged among the justices as they grappled with the significant constitutional and policy ramifications of the case. What's this case about, and what did you hear?
This case is a very interesting case. It's about a proposal from the Catholic Church in Oklahoma. The diocese there would like to create a statewide virtual charter school that would be Catholic in all respects. Now, the government has, many states do fund voucher programs that support religious private schools, but charter schools have long been viewed as public schools. So the idea of having a religious charter school where it's fully funded by public funding, by tax dollars, that infuses religion into everything they do, which is what this school is proposing, is really pushing the boundaries of where we see the separation between church and state. So they have this proposal. They're actually, the approval of this school by a state charter board was challenged by the state's Republican Attorney General, and that's the case that made its way to the Supreme Court today.
And from the arguments, you said it was sort of an ideological split. Is it look like a 6-3 coming out of this?
Well, it's not going to be 6-3, I can say for sure, because one of the justices, Amy Coney Barry, has recused herself, presumably because she has close ties to the Notre Dame Law Clinic that has been backing the Catholic Church in Oklahoma. So there were only 8 justices hearing the case. Yes, we did see a split between the conservatives, the 5 conservatives who heard the case, and the 3 liberals. The conservatives all seemed skeptical of the idea that government could allow secular charter schools and not religious charter schools. The argument that's being made by the school that this amounts to religious discrimination. Now, liberals on the court said it's not discrimination at all. One of them made the point that, the state is saying we want to fund non-sectarian charter schools, and anybody can offer one. If Catholic Church, if you want to sponsor a secular charter school, you can do so. But of course, that's not what's being proposed here today.
You mentioned that the Oklahoma Charter School Board approved the funding, and that was challenged by the Oklahoma Attorney General, the same state government. Anything to make of that?
Of the fact that it was being challenged by the Republican Attorney General?
Is the Charter School Board partisan? Are they Republicans as well?
Well, it's interesting. We have a deep dive into the origins of this case. And we did, as part of that, note that the governor, the Republican governor who supports this school, did make a couple appointments to this, what was then called the State Virtual Charter Board, did make a couple appointments to the board right before the vote happened. And those people did support the school. So there was some partisanship in there. In fact, the chairman of that board, of that Virtual Charter Board, was very much opposed to this proposal and voted against it. But in any case, it was approved by that board. And then it was interesting because initially the Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma supported the school, and as he was in the waning weeks of his term, and then the new Attorney General took over. That's Gettner Drummond, who is the one who brought this case, and he reversed that decision, advised the board not to do this, but they went ahead and did it anyway, and then he filed suit.
We're talking with Laura Meckler from the Washington Post. U.S. Justice Department Solicitor General argued this case as well. Has the position changed now that we've gone from President Biden to President Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I actually am not sure if the Biden administration actually had a chance to weigh in on this, but presumably they would have had a big problem with this proposed charter school. The Trump administration is supportive of the idea of a religious charter school. So, yes, we definitely had the administration weighing in on where you might expect them to come down.
And a final question, you wrote a ruling in favor of the school by the High Court could trigger an explosion of religious schools funded entirely by tax dollars. So looking ahead, if it does go in favor of the school, what do you see?
Well, it's interesting. I actually see two potential outcomes, and it may be different depending on what state you're in. On one hand, I think what we're going to see in some states, like you just quoted me as writing, that we're going to see a big interest from religious schools that are interested in getting taxpayer funding. They don't have to worry about tuition anymore. They might not have to worry about fundraising in the same way. They just get funded by the state. They can continue to be religious. Now, they will have to do certain things as charter schools that they don't have to do as private schools, follow certain rules, take state tests, and some might be turned off by those things. But I think you're going to find there's a lot of interest, especially from schools that are struggling financially, because this is a real lifeline. At the same time, I think we may see in Democratic states a lot of Democratic legislators who are uncomfortable with the idea of funding religion and religious schools directly. And their response may be to go in the other direction, to put new limits on charter schools. For instance, and this came up in the arguments today, they might decide that what they should do is they may decide to say all charter schools have to be run by the school district or run by government, which would have a profound impact on charters in those states, because many of them are now run by private organizations. Or they may say, you know what, we're not going to approve any new charter schools at all, which could have an influence on the sector overall, because they don't want to approve religious charter schools. So it's a lot of different implications, and I think it's going to depend on where we are in the country to know what it might look like.
Laura Meckler, Washington Post education reporter. You can find her stories at WashingtonPost.com and on X at Laura Meckler. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me. This
is Washington Today, and if you'd like to listen to the entire oral argument in that Supreme Court case, we have it at our website, cspan.org. An article from the South Dakota Searchlight. State and federal office holders celebrated Wednesday in Washington, D.C. after prosecutors dropped criminal charges against a South Dakota ranch couple accused of using public land without permission or payment. Meanwhile, basic questions went unanswered. Will the couple continue to use the land? Will they have to start paying a fee? Or is it their land? That was reporting from the South Dakota Searchlight. Leading the news conference outside the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, the Agriculture Secretary, Brooke Rollins.
25 acres of their property touched upon the Buffalo Gap National Grasslands, which is administered by the U.S. Forest Service. The Forest Service allowed them an informal agreement for their cattle to graze for decades, and the family assumed that a process was underway to clearly survey and establish the boundaries. But that didn't happen. The Biden administration criminally charged the Mod family for theft of government property. And for too long, for years now, they have endured a torturous legal process and suffered as victims of the Biden regime's reckless lawfare. Just imagine a government that would be willing to de facto orphan American children over a mere dispute of 25 acres of land. The men of Lexington and Concord knew what sort of government was like, knew what that sort of government was like, and they knew what to do about it. The Mod family, too, faced with destructions at the hand of the state, made their appeal to heaven, and Providence answered. Thanks to the leadership and the unequivocal and bold leadership of President Trump and his directive to put Americans first, we have the pleasure to announce that the criminal prosecution of the Mods is now over. They will not be driven from their home. They will not be jailed. They will not be fined. And their children will grow up with the mother and the father they love and who love them. In our rejoicing, we must also find resolution. The prosecution of the Mods should never have happened. And the fact that it did is, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, a great farmer himself, It is a fire bell in the night. We must awaken to what it means that this appeal and recourse were even necessary at all. We must understand what it signifies that an American family has suffered what the mods have suffered. It means there is a spirit of rule within our federal bureaucracy. It is an arrogance that forgets that the law is there to serve the people and not the people to serve the law.
The Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins at a news conference outside the Agriculture Building in Washington with members of the Maud family. Also, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, who's from South Dakota, like that family. The entire South Dakota congressional delegation plus the South Dakota governor. Senator Rollins also announced the Agriculture Department is launching a new complaint portal for farmers and ranchers, quote, who have fallen victim to unfair and politically motivated lawfare originating under the Biden administration, to request an investigation. Story from Politico. Members of the Senate Commerce Committee narrowly endorsed legislation Wednesday to make daylight saving time permanent, but they remain deeply divided across party and state affiliations over whether to embrace permanent daylight saving time or standard time. President Trump earlier this month said he supported moving to permanent daylight saving time following a hearing on the matter. That was from Politico. Here's Senator Ted Cruz, Republican of Texas, the committee chair, right before the successful vote.
There are times when you have a hearing on a bill and you're trying to move forward with the bill and you think there's a clear right answer. This is not one of those times. At least for me, the testimony we heard at the hearing was very interesting. It persuaded me that we should lock the clock, that the practice of springing forward and falling back every year doesn't make sense, that it has real negative consequences, both in terms of safety, in terms of economic productivity, and so we should lock the clock. I think there were also serious arguments on both sides as to where to lock the clock. We heard serious arguments in favor of daylight savings times from golf courses and other entertainment venues, that having more daylight later in the day was beneficial. We heard serious testimony from physicians that having more daylight earlier in the day was beneficial. And I think reasonable people can differ. That's one reason why I added an amendment to this, Cruz 1, which delays the effective date of the act by 2 years. That is designed to give every state the ability to choose what's the right time to lock for your state.
Senator Ted Cruz, Republican of Texas, chair of the Commerce Committee, at today's meeting before the committee voted to report this bill. The Politico article notes that ultimately the 16-12 vote will have to be repeated at a later date when more senators are physically present. Too many voted by proxy. The final tally, though, provided an important window into where lawmakers currently stand. The vote breakdown on either side of the issue did not fall at all neatly along party lines. That was from Politico. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word and get the stories making headlines in Washington emailed to you every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.